My name is Clark Britton, and for my final project in Women and Gender in the U.S., I'm going to be presenting on the role of Black women in the development of self-help organizations and the importance of these organizations in African American communities. In the third chapter of the textbook, Through Women's Eyes, by Ellen Carl Dubois and Lynn Dumenial, we are shown the different experiences of women around the time of the American Revolution. This was also seen as a period of decline in terms of women's status. White women had to make tough decisions regarding their stance on the war, Native women were struggling with the new borders in the U.S., and Black women were struggling to keep their families secure. This was also around the time that the First Great Awakening occurred, and there were ongoing battles between European powers regarding the land that they owned in the U.S. In the section Freedom and Slavery in this chapter, we are first introduced to the concept of these African American self-help organizations. This section specifically focuses on Black women's experiences in the late 1700s. There were a limited number of free Blacks living in the North and Upper South, and most of them were also limited in their employment options due to their education and rampant discrimination they were facing. Women often worked in domestic occupations, but a few were able to open up their own boarding houses, shops, or schools. Black women were integral in the development of institutions that were committed to self-help, and the development of African American communities too. Sadly, there's not a lot about these societies in our historical record or in the textbook. My plan is to expand upon the book's investigation into self-help organizations, since the book really only broadly mentioned them and didn't go into detail about any specific ones. I intend to focus on specific organizations from the late 1700s onward and the role that Black women had in running them, as well as why these self-help organizations were so important to Black people in the first place. To begin, I'm going to talk about why these self-help groups were so important in African American communities. The source I'm using is a secondary source and is an article titled Rethinking the History of African American Self-Help Rhetoric, and it was written by Jacqueline Bacon. The author received her PhD in English, but has focused on social justice and empowerment with an emphasis on history throughout her career. The majority of her publications are on African American history, women's points of view, and the intersections of race and gender. In her writing, she states that many Black people viewed self-help as the means of improving oneself morally, educationally, religiously, and economically. The main priority for them was to be fully self-sufficient. Many African Americans believe that this was the best way to elevate the status of Black people in the U.S., which is why these organizations took root in the first place. Certain scholars view it as a way that African Americans at the time were adopting white American values with the hope of the Black community becoming accepted in mainstream society. Many famous civil rights leaders like Malcolm X were strong supporters of Black people becoming self-sufficient in order to not require help from white Americans. The first self-help group I'm going to focus on is the Free African Society. The source I'm using is a primary source, as it was written in 1778 by one of the group's members named Reverend William Douglas. It's called The Preamble of the Free African Society. The author is credible due to the fact that he was a part of the founding of this self-help group and took part in the development of the rules in order to become a member. The exact words written were later republished by PBS. This source is really useful in understanding what African Americans were prioritizing when they created these groups. We can see that there is an emphasis on education, caring for widows, and religion. Those who became members were entire family units, and they were asked to pay dues, but weren't turned away if they were unable to. They helped the members who needed it at the time, since this was also a mutual aid society. Women weren't formal leaders of this group, but were very important members. Husbands were even kicked out of the group when infidelities occurred. Ensuring widows were taken care of was important as well, because women were seen as a pillar of the group. The next group I'm focusing on is the Female Literacy Association, which was founded by Sarah Mapps Douglas, who's another important woman who gets little to no recognition in our history books. The source I'm using is a secondary source that's also a journal article in Pennsylvania History, a journal of Mid-Atlantic Studies. The author of this source is Marie Lentorst, who has a PhD and still works at Penn State. Most of her published works are based on African American history. Sarah Mapps Douglas was a writer at the time of the founding of this group who often published her work in abolitionist newspapers. She grew up in a comfortable family with both of her parents working. Her goal with starting this group was to provide Black women with further educational opportunities while also giving them a community space. They met weekly to share what they'd written, and they openly addressed women's suffrage and even wrote letters to political leaders. A more well-known self-help group is the National Association of Colored Women, which was founded by a group of Black women in 1896, but the first president was a suffragist named Nancy Church Terrell. The information I learned about this group came from a secondary source and was published by the National Women's History Museum. The author is Allison Lange, who has a PhD in American history and currently works at the Wentworth Institute of Technology. During her career, she's focused on the intersection between culture, politics, and gender. She's had her work published by many institutions and famous journals. Her main interest is on women's rights and suffrage movements. The main reason for the formation of the National Association of Colored Women was women's suffrage, which would allow women the right to vote and therefore the ability to have a say in those who are running their country. A large part of the founding of this group was because Black women were excluded from white women's suffrage groups, so they needed to provide themselves with their own space. On top of voting rights, this group was a strong promoter of integration, increased educational opportunities for Black people, and more. The group organized voter registration drives, raised money for children to go to school, and provided education about the causes they supported. Although the group was founded with the goal of getting women voting rights, they also advocated for Black men to be able to vote, because despite the fact that they were legally allowed to at the time of the founding of this group, there were many barriers in place to stop them. Most of what this group did was community-based and did not get that much media attention, which is what many women's roles were at the time. Learning about these past self-help groups is important because from it we can begin to understand their current day forms. It's also very interesting to learn about the ways that Black people were striving to become fully self-sufficient despite all they went through at the hands of white Americans during slavery and onward. These groups began to pop up right after emancipation and up until now are still around. Some of the most famous groups that exist now simply for the advancement of Black people include the NAACP, the National Urban League, Rainbow Push Coalition, and many more. Black women remain integral parts of these groups, with many serving as chapter leaders. All of these groups strive for the advancement of Black people, equality, and civil rights. They all raise money and provide services for Black people too. On top of this, they provide a safe space for Black people where they can be surrounded by those who look like them. The fact that these groups still exist is proof that Black people do not have equal status in the U.S. It's important that people become aware of the existence of these groups in the past and those around today to better understand what it is Black people are fighting for and how they intend to get there. Thanks so much for listening. Here are my works cited.